Most alien abduction accounts share certain recurring features: missing time, medical procedures, telepathic communication, and the sense of being studied. However, few accounts describe the abduction phenomenon as a large-scale industrial process. The case of a young woman from Pembrokeshire, Wales, referred to only as Susan, does exactly that. Her testimony, given to British researcher Gavin Davies over a period of months, describes not only personal encounters with non-human beings, but what she believes to be the true purpose behind human abduction. Davies published her account in his 2022 book, Harvest: The True Story of Alien Abduction. In the introduction to that book, he wrote that if there is even a kernel of truth to Susan's story, then there is nothing any of us can do to save ourselves. It is one of the grimmest assessments any researcher has offered about the abduction phenomenon. Davies first made contact with Susan in late 2014. At the time, he had put out a public request for witnesses to the 1977 Welsh Triangle UFO wave, a series of sightings that had taken place across Pembrokeshire during the late 1970s. Susan was among those who responded, and the two arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Haverfordwest, the county town of Pembrokeshire. However, when Davies arrived for the meeting, it quickly became clear that Susan had not contacted him to discuss the events of 1977. She had something far more recent and far more personal that she wished to speak about. She also made it clear that she would only discuss the matter in private. She asked Davies to come to her apartment where they could speak without being overheard. He agreed, and several days later arrived at her flat for what would become the first of many in-depth conversations. During that first sit-down interview, Susan told Davies that most people are unaware of something very dominant that treats humans the way humans treat animals. She stated that we are a commodity to them. She described having witnessed and personally experienced experimentation and unimaginable pain and terror at the hands of a race who are not human. She also told Davies that it was not just her. She had seen many other women subjected to the same treatment, and she believed that countless others, both in the United Kingdom and around the world, had likely been taken but had no conscious memory of it. Sudden memory loss, unexplained rashes, and disturbing recurring dreams, she said, were among the signs that a person might have been taken without knowing it. Although several years had passed since her last direct encounter, Susan told Davies that she lived in constant fear of being taken again. She used a specific phrase to describe how she felt about her future. She believed she could at any time be plucked like corn in a field that is ready to be harvested. The first encounter Susan could consciously recall took place in November 2009. At the time, she was staying with 3 friends at a farmhouse in the Pembrokeshire countryside. The property belonged to the parents of one of her friends and included a converted barn that was used as a guest house. After the group had spent the evening drinking together in the main house, Susan decided she would sleep out in the converted barn. She took with her Lenny, a boxer dog belonging to the family, of whom she was particularly fond. She told Davies she had become quite taken with the animal. It was a decision she would come to regret. Before retiring for the evening, Susan left her 3 friends in the living room and went upstairs to use the bathroom. While she was in there, she noticed what looked like car headlights coming up the driveway towards the house. At the same time, she could hear Lenny barking downstairs in the way he usually did when someone was approaching the property. Then, after only a few seconds, the headlights outside appeared to switch off. At exactly the same moment, the bathroom light also went out, leaving her in complete darkness. A moment later, the entire bathroom was illuminated again, this time by a bright light coming in through the sky window above her. She briefly wondered whether a helicopter might be hovering directly above the house, but she could hear no engine sound, no rotor noise, nothing at all from above. She could still hear her friends talking downstairs and Lenny still barking. Then, as suddenly as it had come on, the external light disappeared. A moment after that, the bathroom light came back on, as if nothing had happened. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. When Susan went back downstairs, her friends told her she had been gone for more than 15 minutes. She insisted she had been upstairs no more than 5 minutes at the most. The discrepancy troubled her, but she dismissed it and tried to put it out of her mind. Several hours later, the 4 friends decided to go to bed. Susan said her goodnights, put Lenny on his lead, and walked him out to the converted barn. She smoked a cigarette by the door, then went inside and climbed into bed. Lenny was already asleep on the bed beside her. She drifted off shortly afterwards. Susan woke suddenly in the early hours. She looked at the clock beside the bed. It read 3:18 a.m. In the same moment, the clock appeared to malfunction and cut out. She had the distinct sensation that someone or something was in the room with her. She could still hear Lenny breathing on the bed beside her. As she squinted into the darkness, she could make out a shape moving nearby, roughly the size of a small child. Just as she was about to sit up, the entire room lit up in the same way the bathroom had done several hours earlier. Lenny woke and began barking intensely, clearly sensing something in the room as well. A sharp pain began to build in Susan's head. She could now see a thin black figure standing in the room, apparently looking directly back at her. Lenny jumped down from the bed and launched himself at the figure. There was a howl of pain from the dog, followed by a flash of light that interrupted the scene. When the light faded, Lenny was completely still. A second flash of light followed, and the dog was gone entirely. A third flash came immediately afterwards, and Susan found herself looking at a featureless black face only inches from her own. The next thing she was aware of was waking up in bed with a start. The clock now read 7:44 a.m. Her entire body ached, and her head felt as though she had a severe hangover. As she made her way to the bathroom, the memory of the night before returned to her. Lenny was nowhere to be seen. At first, she tried to convince herself it had all been a dream and that one of her friends must have come out to the barn and taken the dog for his morning walk. However, when she arrived at the main house, her friend confirmed she had not come to collect him. The 2 of them went out looking for Lenny immediately, but the dog was nowhere on the property. He was never found. Although her friends and their parents told Susan not to blame herself, she sensed that they did. She believed they thought she had failed to lock the door of the barn properly and that Lenny had simply wandered off. Whatever the truth of their feelings, Susan would rarely see those friends again after the incident. She also began to feel physically ill in the days that followed. She suffered from several nosebleeds and from an intense pain behind one of her eyes. The experience had shaken her so badly that she temporarily moved out of her own home and went to stay with her aunt, who lived alone with her cat, Mog. What Susan did not realise at the time was that her ordeal was only beginning. Whatever had taken Lenny from the barn had not finished with her. One evening, while she was staying at her aunt's house, Susan went out with her then boyfriend, Adrian. After picking up some fast food, the couple parked in a car park overlooking the estuary. As they ate, they watched the lights of boats moving on the water. It was then that they noticed a bright orange light out over the estuary that appeared to be hovering in place. The light was growing in size. Susan quickly realised that whatever the object was, it was moving towards them, and she alerted Adrian. He tried to start the car engine, but it repeatedly failed to turn over. The object stopped directly in front of them. Susan would later tell Davies that she could hear a popping sound coming from the air around the object, that everything in their surroundings was bathed in an orange fiery glow, and that she could feel energy pulsating off it as it hung in the air in front of them. Then, without warning, the object shot off into the distance at great speed. The moment it disappeared, the car engine started without trouble. Adrian drove them to the car park of a nearby pub and began phoning friends, wanting to arrange a group to return to the estuary and look for the object. Susan, by this stage, was already beginning to suspect that the object was somehow connected to the strange night at the barnhouse. She wanted to go home. Adrian became annoyed with her. Instead of taking her back to her aunt's house, he drove her to a nearby bus stop and left her there alone. When the bus arrived and Susan sat down, she realised blood was running from her nose. She returned to her aunt's house, showered, and went to bed, still feeling extremely unwell. That night, Susan experienced what at first appeared to be a disturbing nightmare. However, she quickly realised while it was happening that what she was seeing was not a dream in any ordinary sense. She found herself walking along a country lane beside a tall man with a featureless face. Even while she was experiencing it, she understood that this was not a scene drawn from any memory of hers, which meant there was nothing for a dream to be built out of. A bright light then appeared behind them, and she felt fear begin to rise in her. A bright flash followed, and her surroundings changed completely. She was now standing on a street in Haverfordwest. Christmas decorations were visible everywhere, and snow had fallen. Confused as to what was happening, she found herself walking towards a row of pubs. She went inside one of them. It too was decorated for Christmas, and a Christmas song was playing over the sound system. A woman was sitting at the bar. When Susan looked more closely at her, she was shocked to see that it was her own grandmother, who had passed years earlier from cancer. Susan walked over and began to speak with her, although the conversation did not take place out loud. It was telepathic. Her grandmother told her she had to be brave and that she had to help her friends. She reached forward for Susan's arm. As she did so, the music in the pub ground to a halt and the Christmas lights dimmed and went out. Susan became aware of several figures watching the two of them from the shadows of the room. A flash of light occurred, followed by a sharp pain in the back of her head, as though something was being inserted there. She felt herself become paralysed. She could no longer see her grandmother. The only sound she could hear was her own screaming. A moment later, her surroundings changed yet again. She was now sitting in what looked like a cinema. She was facing a large screen, and she sensed someone was sitting behind her, although she found she could not turn around. Images began to appear on the screen. She recognised them immediately as places in her hometown in Pembrokeshire. Initially, the footage resembled a promotional video showing the most appealing parts of the area. However, the footage then changed abruptly to a nature documentary-style scene showing a large spider being swarmed and overtaken by ants. She wanted to look away, but found she was unable to. As the sequence reached its climax, she heard her grandmother's voice once more, followed by another bright flash. She woke suddenly in her bed. Her throat was extremely dry, and she got up to fetch a drink of water. When she opened her bedroom door, the tall, faceless figure from the country lane was standing directly in front of her. It reached forward and touched the side of her head. The next thing she knew, she was back on her bed. The clock read 11 a.m. She was sick for most of the day, and despite having slept for more than 12 hours, felt completely drained. That evening, Susan's aunt, seeing how exhausted she was, offered her 2 sleeping tablets. Susan took them and climbed into bed. She deliberately left her bedroom door open so she could see into her aunt's room across the hallway. However, as soon as she fell asleep, she found herself back in the same scenario as the previous evening. This time, when she entered the pub, the person waiting for her at the bar was not her grandmother, but a young girl. She quickly realised that the girl was herself as a child. Like her grandmother the night before, her younger self spoke to her telepathically, telling her she had done well and that her friends had been very grateful for her help. Susan was then asked a series of what felt like evaluation questions, which she described as being bizarre and intrusive in nature. When the questions were over, the usual flash appeared and she woke up on her bed. This time, however, she found she could not move. She could still see across the hallway into her aunt's room, and more importantly, she could see the mysterious figure now walking towards it. It entered her aunt's room, and it was then that Susan saw what she would later describe only as some kind of strange and monstrous jellyfish. The creature was on the bed, positioned over her sleeping aunt. Susan watched as it moved closer to her aunt's face. A long tendril-like appendage extended from the creature and moved directly into her aunt's nostril. A second tendril stretched out and did the same thing to Mog the cat, only going into the cat's mouth. The cat then began to rise into the air, its body going limp, with the tendrils still attached. At this point, Susan's aunt woke up, saw what was happening around her, and screamed. The next thing Susan was aware of was waking up once more on her bed. It was daylight. The same extreme thirst was still with her. She looked towards her aunt's room, but her aunt was no longer in it. She could hear her in the bathroom, apparently being unwell. Susan went to the bathroom and found her aunt on her knees in front of the toilet. She asked if she was all right, and her aunt responded only by raising her thumb. It was clear her aunt was very unwell. Her aunt told her she must have caught a bug from work and waved her out of the room so she would not catch it too. Susan eventually helped her back to bed. Sometime later, she found Mog the cat asleep on one of the chairs. Even to Susan, the cat did not look himself. Susan managed to get a doctor's appointment for later that day and was prescribed anti-anxiety medication and sleeping tablets. By the time she returned home, her aunt was up and downstairs, still unwell but insisting she felt better. Mog, however, had not eaten all day, and she was worried about him. The evening was largely uneventful, and after several hours, both women went to bed. Susan soon found herself in the same dreamlike state as on the previous 2 nights. This time, however, the figure waiting for her in the pub was her friend Cian, whose dog Lenny had been taken from the barnhouse. As before, the figure spoke to her telepathically. She told Susan that Lenny was with her friends and that it was Susan's fault he had gone missing. She was told again that she had to help these friends and that she had to be brave. The music stopped, the strange figures became visible around her once more, and after the usual flash, Susan was back in the cinema room. Footage of Pembrokeshire began to play, this time showing the streets, the estuary, and ordinary people going about their daily business. Then the footage changed. The skies in the scene darkened. The camera was now focused on the estuary, the same stretch of water where Susan and Adrian had seen the orange object. The water became increasingly choppy, and fires could be seen everywhere. The sea itself appeared to be on fire, and a wall of burning water was rushing down through the estuary. Susan watched as cars were swept past as though they were toys. People on the streets were caught by the burning wave as it overtook them. Buildings collapsed. An oil tanker on the water tipped onto its side and exploded with such force that the footage itself shook. The screen eventually faded to black. The footage then returned, but now it was showing the aftermath of what she had just witnessed. The devastation was total, and survivors could be seen wandering through the wreckage or searching for those they had lost. Susan described it as one of the most harrowing scenes she had ever witnessed. She could not shake the feeling that what she had seen was a vision of the future. Then a young girl, who had clearly been caught up in the disaster, looked directly into the camera and directly at Susan, urging her simply to run. A flash occurred and Susan woke in her bed. She went downstairs immediately. When she reached the living room, she found her aunt standing there, holding the lifeless body of Mog in her arms. Following the 3 consecutive nights of intense activity, matters settled down somewhat. Susan's aunt, however, despite being told by her doctor that she was suffering from a bout of flu, continued to be unwell. Things eventually came to a head when her aunt suggested that Susan should move out and return to her parents' home. Susan did so. For several months, things remained relatively quiet. Her aunt's condition, however, continued to deteriorate. She was eventually admitted to hospital, where it was discovered that she had extremely advanced cancer. She passed away 1 week later. Shortly after her aunt's funeral, Susan decided she would find a flat and live alone. After what had happened to Lenny and then to her aunt and to Mog, she could not shake the feeling that she would bring danger to her parents' home if she continued to live there. Around this time, a new series of recurring dreams began, and these would progress to become more unsettling than anything that had come before. In these dreams, she would find herself walking through a field along with several other women whom she did not know. She would also experience strange encounters while driving to and from university, including repeated sightings of the same orange object she and Adrian had seen over the estuary. She began to feel as though the object was following her, tracking her movements. The constant feeling of anxiety, which had faded somewhat after she left her aunt's house, returned in full. In the dreams, she would also see foxes and owls, and she wondered whether these animals carried any symbolic meaning. She was always in the fields, always with other women. On one particular evening, after she had gone to bed in her new flat, she became aware that she was now standing in the street outside, still wearing her pyjamas. On the street, she saw a tall figure she sensed was female. It was wearing a red coat, and its face was covered by a hood. Susan turned and made her way back to the flat, beginning to question whether she was truly awake. She returned to the flat, went to the window and looked out. She could not see the figure, but she noticed that the street was now bathed in a strange red glow. She remained at the window for a while, before returning to the living room. When she got there, the tall figure in the red coat was standing inside her flat, apparently waiting for her. More bizarre still, the figure was standing inside some kind of vortex, which Susan thought might be a portal or some form of teleportation device. Susan described this creature to Davies as clearly feminine in form, although not human. Its head was larger than the rest of its body, and it had enormous dark eyes that were, as she put it, more insect than human. The figure stepped towards Susan and touched one of its claw-like hands to her head. Susan immediately felt something like an electric shock pass through her body. A moment later, she went completely silent, describing the sensation as though the world had stopped spinning and time itself had frozen. The figure then stepped back, re-entered the vortex, and both of them disappeared, leaving Susan alone with a strange static clicking sound audible all around her. The most unsettling of Susan's accounts, however, came during one of her final interview sessions with Davies. This time, the events were not presented as a dream. They took place while she was fully conscious, driving home after visiting her parents. It was around 8 p.m. She was driving along a rural road when a fox ran out in front of her car. She watched the fox for several seconds before noticing that the familiar red glow was overtaking her surroundings. The headlights of her car then faded and everything went black. The next thing Susan could recall was walking out of an area of woodland and into a field. The entire sky above her was bathed in red. She stumbled forward for a few moments before noticing the fox sitting a short distance away from her. As soon as she looked at it, the fox turned and ran. Susan had the strong sense that the fox wanted her to follow it into an area of tall grass. She did so. As she walked, she began to notice other women in the field as well. Eventually, there were dozens of women of various ages, all moving in the same direction. Her recurring dream, she now realised, had not been a memory of a past event. It had been a premonition of what was now happening. Susan began to notice a trembling in the ground that grew progressively stronger. The women then began to lift off the ground with a distinct whooshing sound, spiralling and twisting as they rose. Susan recalled an intense red light and excruciating pain before everything went black. When she came to, she was standing in a long line of women in what appeared to be a dark, uninviting room. The women were packed so tightly together that their bodies were almost touching. She tried to look ahead, but saw only a seemingly endless line of women stretching away in front of her. Then she noticed a light above the line that was moving closer. She could see that it had what looked like wings on either side of a glowing red orb, and it appeared to be scanning the women below. As it passed over them, it was spraying them with a misty substance. Susan noticed that the spray appeared to have a calming effect on the women it touched. Because they were pressed so tightly together, the women were forced forward by the steps of the women behind them. When any woman fell or tried to climb out of the line, the winged red lights forced them back into place. When one woman fell forward and lost her balance, one of the winged lights extended a tube-like device and carried her away. As they moved, Susan noticed that the floor beneath them was becoming increasingly slippery and difficult to walk on. The line continued to move forward, one systematic step at a time. Susan also told Davies she had the strong sense that the women were being herded into areas based on their type, their body type, their age and their health. As they continued forward, eventually entering a tunnel of sorts, Susan could increasingly hear cries of distress coming from further ahead. The line eventually emerged into a larger room. It was in this larger room, she believed, that the women were being sorted into different sections for different purposes. Susan and the women in her immediate group had various samples taken from them. Although the procedures were invasive, they left her physically uninjured. However, what she witnessed happening in other parts of the room was, she said, far worse, so far beyond ordinary human cruelty that she told Davies she was not willing to have it written down. She said that some of what she saw in that room served no purpose to describe, and she asked that it be left unspoken. What she would say was that the women there were being used, methodically and without mercy, for purposes she could only partly comprehend, and that the things done to them in the worst of those sections were among the reasons she had come to believe humanity was regarded as nothing more than livestock. The next thing Susan was aware of was waking up in a field. She could see the headlights of her car on the road a short distance away. When she made her way back to her vehicle, she found her clothes in an untidy pile next to the car door. When she looked at the dashboard clock, it read 8:03 p.m. Although the ordeal had seemed to last for hours, and indeed might have for Susan, in the reality of Earth, only 3 minutes had passed. That incident would be, as far as Susan was aware, the last encounter she would experience. However, at the time of her interviews with Davies, she continued to live in fear that the beings would return at any moment. Following her final conversations with Davies, Susan disappeared into anonymity. She told him she had purchased a plane ticket from Heathrow Airport to an undisclosed location and would not be returning. Before she left, however, she offered Davies her own interpretation of what these entities were. She told Davies that she believed these beings were very old and very advanced, and that they operated on a technical level that far exceeded anything humanity has any grasp of. She dismissed many of the conventional theories that have been put forward to explain alien abduction. She did not believe the entities were human time travellers collecting biological samples for scientific study. She also dismissed the idea that they came from inside the Earth or from the moon. The hell they came from, she said, was way beyond all that. She believed that they had found humanity in its infancy, had permitted the species to thrive and spread across the world, and had been harvesting humans a little to begin with, and increasingly as the population had grown. In her view, she added, humanity is defenceless against them. Susan also described what she believed was a hierarchy among the various entities she had encountered during her abductions, suggesting a highly organised operation rather than isolated incidents. The implications of her account, if any part of it is accurate, are severe. The footage she was shown in the cinema room depicting the destruction of Pembrokeshire and the burning estuary was, in her interpretation, a genuine preview of a future event. As with any abduction case, Susan's account cannot be independently verified. There is no physical evidence of her experiences. Critics have pointed out that intense nightmares, false memories, and the lingering effects of long-term anxiety could account for much of what she describes. The disappearance of her friend's family dog Lenny, the illness and rapid decline of her aunt from advanced cancer, and the passing of her aunt's cat, Mog, all have mundane explanations that do not require the involvement of non-human entities. However, supporters of her account have noted that her description of the processing facility contains details such as the sorting of women by body type and age, the various production lines, and the insect-like nature of the overseeing beings, that echo elements found in a number of other abduction accounts from around the world. Gavin Davies himself stated that if even a kernel of her story is true, then humanity faces a problem it cannot solve. Susan remains, as of the publication of Harvest, one of the most disturbing abduction witnesses on record, not because of the strangeness of what she describes, but because of what she says it means.